The Honourable, the member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place today on a point of privilege. I believe the government has shown contempt for the Public Accounts Committee, the Auditor General, and by extension the House of Assembly by refusing full access to the documents requested by the Auditor General related to his full-scope audit of the nominee program. On October 31, 2007, the Public Accounts Committee passed a motion requesting that the Auditor General perform a full-scope audit of the economic stream of the nominee program, specifically the Business Mentorship Program. The Auditor General, soon after the Public Accounts Committee request, agreed to convene a full-scope audit of that troubled program. On June 11, 2008, the Auditor General released the first report related to the nominee program. The Auditor General reported that the government was unwilling to provide his office with total access to the full breadth of documents related to the business mentorship file. In the June 11th report, the Auditor General stated, quote, "Throughout the audit, we encountered restrictions in obtaining the information required to complete our work. We were denied a significant number of documents based on claims they were either cabinet documents or subject to solicitor-client privilege. Further, certain program files were held back until they could be reviewed and purged of documents that the Office of Immigration believed were confidential. Restricting the Auditor General's access to information constitutes poor public accountability. It is not in the public interest to do so, and further, it is in contravention of the right to information contained in the Auditor General Act," unquote. The Auditor General Act is clear relating to the full access to information granted to the Auditor General and his office. Section 10 of the Act reads, "Notwithstanding the provisions of any other act, every officer, clerk, or employee of an agency of government shall provide the Auditor General with such information and explanation as the Auditor General requires, and the Auditor General shall have free access at all times to files, records, books of account, and other documents in whatever form related to the accounts of any agency of government," unquote. The government clearly ignored their own law in refusing full and complete access to the documents requested by the Auditor General's office. After receiving the June report, the Public Accounts Committee issued subpoenas demanding the disclosure of the requested documents to the committee and to the Auditor General. On July 15, 2008, the government decided to allow partial access to the documents requested by the Auditor General. However, the government still remained defiant and in contravention of the Auditor General Act by disallowing full and complete access to the requested documents. The government agreed to allow the Auditor General's staff the ability to view the documents at Department of Justice offices, but continued to refuse the Auditor General's office the ability to copy or transfer documents to their office for a full and complete analysis. By curtailing the Auditor General's ability to do his work, the government was, by extension, curtailing my ability as a member of the Public Accounts Committee to do my work. It is clearly stated on both the Parliament of Canada's website as well as the Auditor General of Canada's website that the Auditor General is an officer of Parliament. The same is also true of the UK parliamentary system. The Provincial Auditor General Act does not clearly state that our Auditor General is an officer of the House, but certainly a recognized convention has been established by the upper houses in Canada and the United Kingdom, and the Nova Scotia Legislature takes procedural direction from both of these upper houses. I believe the government has infringed on my rights and privileges as a member of the Public Accounts Committee and as a member of the House of Assembly by refusing the Auditor General, an officer of the House of Assembly, the full access to documents as is his statutory right. The Auditor General believed these documents were relevant to the scope of the audit requested by myself and by the Public Accounts Committee, and full access should have been granted at his request. Mr. Speaker, I believe I have provided sufficient evidence for you to rule that there is a prima facie case of privilege on this matter, and I would ask that you proceed in dealing with my subsequent motion of censure.
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in response to the statement just read by the member for Halifax-Clayton Park, I would like to officially note with you and to all members of the House but the government does not agree with the statement made. In fact, there are several erroneous statements made in that, Mr. Speaker. And I would say that, Mr. Speaker, in your deliberations, as part of that context,
Order, please.
I'll be supplying to you our response once we have the opportunity to review the full content of the statement. And again, I object to that, Mr. Speaker, and note the erroneous nature of such a claim.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place with respect to the matter that has been raised here by the honourable member from Clayton Park to indicate that although we did not have advance notice of the motion, and certainly advance notice is not required, but it would have certainly have been appreciated. It would have allowed us, I think, to offer a more fulsome opinion on the matter that is being brought here for your consideration. Mr. Speaker, it is the case that the Public Accounts Committee were most concerned about the withholding of documents from the Auditor General, and indeed you will be aware that subpoenas were issued by the committee to various ministers of the Crown and deputy ministers to produce the documents. And ultimately, the Auditor General indicated in his final report on the nominee program that he was satisfied with the extent to which he was given access to documents. However, the Auditor General did indicate that he is concerned that this practice not continue into the future, and that the integrity of his office be upheld and respected by the government. And however, for that reason, the full committee, the Public Accounts Committee, did indeed pass a motion to rescind the subpoenas, and at that time there was, I believe, unanimous agreement at the Public Accounts Committee, and no matters of privilege were raised at that time. You may want to take that into consideration as you deal with this matter. And Mr. Speaker, indeed, there will be a transfer. And I hear the member from Cape Breton Centre indicating that he feels that would be very.
Order, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. The member from Cape Breton South saying that it's important that you have all of the information, and I know that's always his position in this House, Mr. Speaker. So with that, with those words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place. Thank you very much.
To all members of the House, I'm going to take this matter under advisement, and we will get back to the House on the earliest possible time after reviewing some of the documentation that's been mentioned today. The draw has taken place for the late debate tonight. It's submitted by the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre. Therefore, be it resolved that the government take the necessary action and waive right-of-way easement fees to the grid for utility companies so that the residents in the Upper Ohio area can be provided with essential electric service. We'll now commence with the daily routine. Presenting and reading of petitions. The Honourable, the member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The operative clause, we the undersigned residents of the municipality of East Hants, District 5 and surrounding area, and including otherwise users and supporters of Anthony Park, do petition the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources to refrain from demolition of the Anthony Park Wharf until such time that alternative and acceptable solutions can be devised in conjunction with staff from his department that will result in the restoration of the wharf for continued public use. And Mr. Speaker, there's about 1,050 signatures, and I've put my signature on this petition in support.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and if I could be permitted to make an introduction.
Please do.
I'd like to draw the House's attention to the West Gallery, where today we are joined by Mr. Bill Knowlton and his wife Wendy. And as many of you know, over the last week, Mr. Knowlton had walked well over 200 kilometers from Bridgetown to Province House with the assistance of his wife Wendy in hopes of promoting poverty and the issues of the poverty reduction strategy being implemented to the province. So I'd like to welcome them. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition, and the operative clause reads, I, the undersigned, understand that poverty is at epidemic proportions in Nova Scotia, and it is time that steps were taken to eliminate such situations. There are over 1,000 signatures affixed to this, and my name is as well.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth, Halifax, Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's quite okay. I know you have a lot of us to keep track of. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the attention, your attention and the attention of the members to your gallery, Mr. Speaker, where we're joined today by two guests who I would ask to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House, and that's Danny Kavanagh, the President of CUPE Nova Scotia, and Leanne McMillan, who is a staff member with the Canadian Union of Public Employees.
The Honourable, the member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a petition on behalf of the Beachville residents who are opposed to industrial development. The operative phrase is, the enclosed petition illustrates the residents of Beachville Estates strongly oppose the HRM amendment to the Timberlea Lakeside Beachville Municipal Strategy and Planning Act. There are 282 names to this petition, Mr. Speaker, and I have affixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 4 Nova Scotians were presented yesterday with our province's inaugural Medal of Bravery, and whereas the award was established in this legislature to honour those citizens in our province who have risked their own safety to help others. And whereas the first medal recipients are Jeffrey Scaling of Canning, Ira Moody Barkhouse, and Arnold Wynot of Mahone Bay, and A.G. McCrae of Black Point, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House salute and thank these true Nova Scotia heroes for their courage and selflessness, and commend the esteemed members of our advisory panel chaired by Constance Glooby for their service in choosing these deserving recipients. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I introduce this resolution, I might have your permission for an introduction, please.
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, most of the members of the House would know, all members would know, last week in Spring Hill we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the bump. Very tragic coal mining industry, a tragedy that basically devastated the industry in Spring Hill. Mr. Speaker, there's pins on the members' desks that we've dedicated a highway in memory of all miners in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, there's members have pins, and I appreciate they wear those and to show support for present miners and past. Mr. Speaker, in the gallery today, and as well, Mr. Speaker, after the resolution, I'd like to have permission of the House for a moment of silence as well, in regards to all miners who perished in this province. Mr. Speaker, in your gallery today, we have some very important people that I want to recognize today, and I would ask, as I call their names, if they would rise if they're able to. No, one gentleman can't, Mr. Speaker, but the first one is Mr. Harold Bryan. These are the last 3 surviving members of the bump that are still alive today. Mr. Harold Bryan, who was trapped underground for 6.5 days. Mr. Herb Pepperdine, who was trapped underground for 8.5 days. and Mr. Garnet Clark, who was trapped underground for 8.5 days. And Mr. Speaker, in the true model of miners, no man left behind. These 3 men were not left behind as a result of heroic efforts of so many people. Also with them, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also with these folks is Holly Clark, who is Mr. Garnet Clark's wife, Jessica Harrett, who's an RN with Highcrest Nursing Home in Spring Hill, Mr. Doug Dobson, who's a town councillor in Spring Hill, and no, that's not my daughter, that's my wife, Linda. So I'd ask to give them a warm welcome as well, please. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the town of Spring Hill, Cumberland County, was changed forever at 8:06 p.m. on October 23, 1958, when the most severe bump ever recorded in North American mining history devastated this small town and its coal industry, the bump resembling an earthquake that hit the number 2 colliery with all of its fury was felt for miles. Whereas as the world waited and those on the surface kept their vigil, dragger teams and barefaced miners toiled below the surface, trying to reach trapped miners. On November 1st, the last group of survivors were found. The bodies of the remaining miners were brought to the surface, and at final count of the 174 miners in number 2 colliery, 75 were killed. And whereas this year, on October 23, 2008, 50 years later, we remember and mourn the 75 miners who lost their lives, and we celebrate the ones who survived as we show our pride for the people of the miracle town of Spring Hill, who showed the true spirit of Spring Hillers in the face of tragedy, adversity, and the many challenges that this community faced as they came together with the support and help of so many to survive the bump, while we thank the miners, doctors, nurses, police officers, and other emergency services, and the many volunteers who assisted. Therefore, be resolved that members of the Nova Scotia Legislature remember the 1958 bump in the mining community of Spring Hill and send our best wishes to the miners, their families, and the residents of Spring Hill as they remember the sad occasion and celebrate the spirit of Spring Hill. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate in a moment of silence.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Thank you. The Honourable the Premier.
I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this province has shown tremendous growth in the financial services sector, attracting hundreds of new jobs for Nova Scotians. Whereas to ensure that we do not have to in future turn business away from our shores, it is paramount that we continue to further our goal of promoting development across the province. And whereas a focus of that work is to ensure that there is sufficient office space for companies when they decide to bring their business to the capital, especially as we continue to foster our financial services sector growth. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House encourage business, therefore supporting Nova Scotia families wanting to work, live, and thrive here at home by supporting this government's efforts to promote the availability of prime office space to accommodate these vital business needs. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's first Minister of Immigration Advisory Council held its first meeting September the 30th, 2008. And whereas the 13-member council is apprised of a wide spectrum of expertise and backgrounds, and among the new appointees are business, municipal, labour and community leaders, many of whom have left their homelands to build highly successful and rewarding careers here in Nova Scotia. Whereas these respected individuals are giving gracious of their time and expertise to help our province reach its immigration goals and objectives. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly extend thanks to the new Council and its members for their commitment to the economic and cultural growth of this province. Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas almost 5 months ago, the province experienced the biggest wildland-urban interface forest fire in its history. And whereas Department of Natural Resources staff led the charge of cooperation between dozens of agencies to successfully extinguish the blaze. And whereas their contributions to our forestry sector, to wildlife habitat, to preserving the beauty of Nova Scotia, to the place we live and play, will go down in history. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank the heroes of the Porters Lake fire for going above and beyond the call of duty and for making our province extremely proud. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I would like to do an introduction.
Please do.
Thank you. I would like to draw the attention of the members to the East Gallery. John Humble is the Atlantic Regional Director for United Nations International Children's Fund, and joining Mr. Humble is Sherry Cole, who is the Manager of Community Partnerships and Events with UNICEF. I would ask both to stand and receive a warm welcome of the House before I read the resolution. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canadian children have raised more than $96 million since the UNICEF Halloween campaign was launched in 1955, and whereas UNICEF Atlantic works closely with schools and youth groups across Nova Scotia each year to educate our children on the importance of helping the world's students receive an education, and whereas this year schools in our province are taking part in the annual UNICEF campaign to help provide children with the tools they need for a proper education, therefore be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly congratulate all students participating in this year's UNICEF campaign and recognize October 31st as UNICEF Day in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 6th to October 12th mark Provincial Public Service Week, and whereas more than 10,000 civil servants across our province provide services that keep our families safe, our businesses growing, and our communities thriving, and whereas recognition for employees goes well beyond a single week, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognizes the hard-working, resourceful, and innovative civil servants and the service they provide to the citizens of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Health Promotion and Protection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 77% of Nova Scotians aged 65 and over and 94% of long-term care facility residents have received their free flu vaccine through the Health Promotion and Protection Flu Vaccination Program in 2007. And whereas again this year, the Northwood employees offered their assistance to the Department of Health Promotion and Protection to launch our 2008-2009 flu vaccination campaign at Northwood Centre earlier this month. And whereas through the tremendous support and contribution of healthcare providers and our healthcare partners, Nova Scotians have received and continue to receive their flu shot at doctors' offices and clinics across the province. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House support the initiative by asking all Nova Scotians, including high-risk individuals, healthcare providers, and students in healthcare programs in their communities, to get their flu shot. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Foster Family Appreciation Week in Nova Scotia was celebrated last week from October 19th to 25th, and foster care resource teams are working across the province to raise awareness about the rewards of fostering a child or youth. And whereas in Nova Scotia, foster parents work as part of a team of professionals who ensure children and youth receive the love and support they need. And whereas Nova Scotia is committed to attracting and training caring families who can help children and youth, and that in recent years, Nova Scotia has made great strides in recruiting and retraining foster parents with significant success. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend Nova Scotia's existing foster families and encourage more families to open their hearts and homes to children in need. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the strong and vibrant entrepreneurial spirit is a key ingredient of prosperous Nova Scotia, and whereas Junior Achievement is the world's largest organization dedicated to educating students about entrepreneurship and also holds an annual worldwide competition where students attempt to be the most successful at running a mock company, and whereas out of 238 high school and university teams around the world, the team of Dan Shoup and Neil Stewart of Auburn Drive High School in Cole Harbour became the first Nova Scotia team to reach the global finals in Colorado Springs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Dan and Neil for their hard work, entrepreneurial spirit, and success in this competition. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the month of October marks Canada's Healthy Workplace Month, and whereas the efforts of healthy workplace committees promoted healthy living, safer and greener work environments, and more supportive workplace cultures throughout the month by encouraging employees to take the Healthy Workplace Challenge. And whereas the Healthy Workplace Committees provide a valuable service to the health and well-being of civil servants and to the health of our organization throughout workplace initiatives. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly recognizes the beneficial contribution of Healthy Workplace Committees on employees' health and well-being in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introductions of bills. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Make Mandatory the Reporting of Child Pornography.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Make Mandatory the Reporting of Child Pornography.
Bill number 187, an act to make mandatory the reporting of child pornography.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I do an introduction before I introduce my bill?
Please do.
Thank you. I'd like to draw the attention of the host to the West Gallery. I'd like to introduce Bernie McKinnon, Bill Falkingham, Gordon DeLong, David Burnett, John Cunningham, Lyle Donovan, Preston Ilsley, and Mike Lockett. They are here today representing fire service across Nova Scotia. I'd like the host to give them a warm welcome. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 376 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Public Service Act, to establish the Office of Fire and Emergency Services.
Hear, 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 hear.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 376 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Act, to establish the Office of Fire and Emergency Services.
Bill number 188, an act to amend Chapter 376, the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Act, to establish the Office of Fire and Emergency Services.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting a Memorial Day to Honor Miners.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting a Memorial Day to Honour Miners.
Bill number 189, an act respecting a Memorial Day to honor miners.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 98 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Cooperative Associations Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 98 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Cooperative Associations Act.
Bill number 190, an act to amend Chapter 98 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Cooperative Associations Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill number 191, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the member for Timberlea Prospect.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Bill number 192, an act to amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 302 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Municipal Grants Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 302 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Municipal Grants Act.
Bill number 193, an act to amend Chapter 302 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Municipal Grants Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 334 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnership Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 334 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnership Act.
Bill number 194, an act to amend Chapter 334 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnership Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 335 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnerships and Business Names Registration Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 335 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnerships and Business Names Registration Act.
Bill number 195, an act to amend Chapter 335 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Partnerships and Business Names Registration Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the selfless courage of Nova Scotia miners and their families was viewed around the world in 1958 through television coverage of the devastating bump and the rescue effort which followed. And whereas the lives lost and the miracles of survival that marked the Spring Hill mining disaster were commemorated this month in the town of Spring Hill. And whereas the remaining survivors, their descendants, and the wider community used the anniversary to remember and to honor all those whose lives were touched by the disaster. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the work done by so many residents of Spring Hill to very fittingly commemorate the 1958 mining disaster and to remind us all about the tremendous strength of character and bedrock values that make our province one of the best places in the world. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jack Campbell, a Nova Scotia businessman and entrepreneur, passed away on Monday, October 20th at the age of 72. And whereas Mr. Campbell's entrepreneurial spirit led him to his beloved Peggy's Cove, where he built and established several businesses, including the present-day Southwestern Restaurant. And whereas his passion for people, politics, and community were realized in his service as a municipal councillor in Windsor and his long-time involvement with the Nova Scotia Liberal Party, therefore it be it resolved that the House of Assembly recognize the life and accomplishments of Jack Campbell and send our most sincere condolences to the family and friends. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas New Glasgow native Margie Beck retired after 38 years with the Shenectady Central Regional School Board, but didn't stop working, and whereas Ms. Beck is now a part-time employee with the Highland Community Residential Services and uses her skills, knowledge, and community networks to assist those facing mental health challenges and with residential support. Whereas Ms. Beck is involved with several HCRS programs such as United in Friendship, a program that recognizes the importance good friends play in a child's life and works with parents and special needs children to develop friendships. Margie still makes time to devote to her other important interests, her grandchildren and gardening. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send best wishes to Margie Beck for her tireless commitment to her community and for proving that retirement can hold new beginnings and not endings. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2007 federal budget shocked Nova Scotians by breaking the offshore revenue accord that had ensured Nova Scotia would receive 100% of the revenue from our offshore oil and gas developments. And whereas the Premier, this House, and many Nova Scotians urged all Nova Scotia members of Parliament to oppose the budget legislation that broke the offshore accord. And whereas the Member of Parliament for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley provided a turning point in the effort to gain redress by voting against his own government, as requested. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Bill Casey on his overwhelming victory in the recent federal election and thank him for his dedication to Nova Scotia's best interests. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton South. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cape Breton-born Daniel McIver continues to distinguish himself as one of Canada's greatest playwrights, whereas Daniel McIver has recently received Canada's richest theatre award, the $100,000 Seminovich Prize, and whereas Daniel McIver adds this prestigious award to his 2006 Governor General's Award for Drama, therefore be it resolved that members of the Nova Scotia Legislature, and indeed all Nova Scotians, pay tribute to this very gifted native son of Cape Breton and wish him continued success in the future. I would ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I could do an introduction, please.
Please.
Mr. Speaker, in your gallery are two residents of Victoria the Lakes who are here this afternoon to view the proceedings of the legislature. I would ask that Brenda Wall and Tom Vickers stand and receive the warm welcome from the House. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Snowmobilers Association of Nova Scotia consists of 20 member clubs while representing 2,400 snowmobiling families, and whereas the Crowdis Mountain Snowmobile Club, based in Victoria County, under the leadership of President Linda Cheney, were recognized at the end of the 2007-2008 snowmobile season for having the outstanding snowmobile groomer in the province in Ralph Hannum of Quebec. And whereas Ralph is referred to as the Trail Master by his fellow club members, spending numerous hours on trail maintenance while also finding even more additional time to repair equipment. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House compliment Ralph Hannum of Quebec on his Outstanding Groomer Operator Award in 2007-2008, and wish him every success as he enters the 2008-2009 winter season, dressed in a Storm Tech 3-in-1 parka, presented him by the Snowmobile Association of Nova Scotia on winning his award last winter. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a group of women from the North End of Halifax have been meeting every Wednesday morning at the Halifax North Memorial Library for 3 decades. And whereas these women, under the name of the Halifax North Library Women's Group, have been involved in and supportive of many community initiatives and actions over the years. And whereas this group recently celebrated its 30th anniversary with a celebration whose very appropriate theme was Pearls of Wisdom. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate the members of the Halifax North Library Women's Group on their 30 years of commitment and activism, and express their wish that the group will continue to contribute to the community in the years to come. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the untimely passing of Ilmadam resident Jean-Claude Benoit has dealt a severe blow to his family and surrounding community, and whereas J.C. Benoit spent the majority of his life as an emergency responder, first as a member of the Canadian Coast Guard and then as an emergency medical technician, providing emergency care to many and comfort to families in their time of loss. Whereas on Saturday, October 25th, many friends, family, first responders, and fellow emergency medical technicians gathered at Our Lady of Assumption Church in Arishat to celebrate the life of J.C. Benoit. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly extend their deepest sympathy to J.C. Benoit's parents, Phil and Pauline Benoit, his brother Mitch, sister Laurie, and daughter Ariel, while remembering J.C.'s unselfish service and dedication to the residents of Ilmadam and surrounding areas. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Pictou County's latest idol is not even a singer, whereas East Coast FM 94.1 DJ Anne McGregor can now claim the distinction of being Canada's media idol, beating out 9 other media personalities from across the country. And whereas the New Glasgow native entered the charitable competition earlier in the year and was crowned the Atlantic Region representative in Halifax before heading to Toronto. With votes from Canada's most supportive county, McGregor was able to make more than $2,000 in financial contributions to her favourite charity, the Pictou County SPCA. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send heartfelt congratulations to East Coast FM 94.1 Anne McGregor after being declared Canada's media idol for 2008. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Hants East.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas participation in sports has long been recognized as an activity that brings out the best of our citizens. And whereas exemplary results are always the result of exemplary efforts, most often over a period of years, being the model for others to aspire to. And whereas such an effort resulted in a bronze medal in rowing for Tracy Cameron of Shubenacadie during the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Tracy Cameron on her exemplary athletic performance in capturing an Olympic bronze medal in Beijing in 2008. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotians can now feel at ease when dining out because of the availability of restaurant inspections online. And whereas the Minister of Agriculture, who previously thought there was no need for public disclosure of those reports because it could hurt business, now clearly sees the value in the Liberal bill introduced this past spring and decided this practice should move forward. And whereas this is yet another example of how government can accomplish something worthwhile if they take the advice of the Liberal Party. Mr. Speaker, therefore, be it resolved that the Premier and all his ministers look to the Liberal Party for ideas on how to make Nova Scotia a safer, more prosperous province. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Introduction. The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the attention of the legislature to members of to James McCormick and members of the lobbying committee from the political lobbying committee of the NSGEU who are here to observe the opening of the House and the various pieces of legislation, and I'd ask them, the members, to welcome them to the House.
The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ingonish Home Hardware Building Centre is the only home hardware store in Canada, which also houses a physiotherapy clinic, and whereas the Ingonish Home Hardware Building Centre is owned by Judith and Kurt Hussey, Judith might be recognizable to some for her national television commercial appearances for home hardware. And whereas upon purchasing the hardware store in 2005, Kurt and Judith undertook extensive renovations and expanded the facility from 3,300 square feet to 4,500 square feet and employed 10 people full-time year-round. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Kurt and Judith Hussey of Ingonish, Victoria County, for operating such a vibrant business and making everyone feel welcome upon entering their store. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mariana Hope of Salem, Pictou County was recently recognized by the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada as a 2008 Volunteer of Distinction. And whereas Mariana was instrumental in establishing the Northumberland Brain Tumor Support Group, where she volunteers as a facilitator in helping others. And whereas the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada gave this award to Mariana for her exceptional gift of time, passion, and expertise in educating and informing others. Therefore, be resolved that this Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Mariana Hope on being recognized as a Volunteer of Distinction with the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada and wishes her continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotians have become increasingly frustrated with this government's inability to admit that gas regulation has been a failure. And whereas recently this frustration was echoed by Valerie Payne, President of the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, who remarked that, and I quote, promises of stable gasoline prices and increased opportunities for independent gasoline retailers to make a profit, especially in the rural areas, haven't materialized, end of quote. And whereas by refusing to listen
Order,
to
please. The Honourable, the member for Clare has the floor.
Did you want me to begin? Start over again? No? Okay. Whereas by refusing to listen to the business community on this issue, the government has demonstrated just how out of touch they really are. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier listen to our valued business community and scrap this failed program immediately. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Port Hawkesbury Junior Straight Pirates hockey team have been an institution for over 40 years in the Strait area, whereas the Pirates are back for the 2008-2009 season with new head coach Brian Tracy and a strong nucleus of young players such as Brandon Mullins, Graham DeCoste, and Aaron Schwartz. Whereas the Straight Pirates' ultimate goal for the year is not only to win the league championship, but also the Don Johnson Cup, recognizing Junior B hockey supremacy in Atlantic Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House extend our best wishes to this year's Port Hawkesbury Straight Pirates junior hockey team and all of our young hockey hopefuls across the province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Wayne McIntyre, social studies teacher at Herring Cove Junior High School, set out last year to show his students the magnitude of the Holocaust by gathering and linking paper clips.
The chatter is getting a little loud. The Honourable the member for Halifax Atlantic.
To represent some of the 6 million lives lost because of intolerance in World War II. And whereas Wayne and his students last summer traveled under the auspices of the Asper Foundation to Washington, D.C. to study human rights and visit museums. And whereas, in recognition of Holocaust Week, Wayne and his students yesterday joined students from other Halifax area schools to string 20,000 paper clips around the base of Citadel Hill, laying them along sidewalks amongst pedestrians and passing through construction zones. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the students who participated in the paperclip project for Holocaust Week, recognize their work as a moving piece of installation art, which is not only a tribute to the lost souls of the Holocaust, but a fitting reminder of the individual importance of every soul in society in this year when we celebrate democracy in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Truro and Area Chamber of Commerce presents an award each year to a small local business, less than 5 years old, fewer than 10 employees, and whereas Helen and Perry Brightman started their business Classic Rentals 5 years ago because of the need for a locally owned company to provide rentals both large and small, and whereas the Brightmans developed and expanded their business and have become known for their determination to provide their customers with what they need, therefore be it resolved, all members of this House congratulate Helen and Perry Brightman for having their business Classic Rentals named as the Truro and Area Chamber Small Business of the Year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Shubenacadie Canal Commission has been committed to overseeing and promoting the historical and environmental significant Shuby Canal System since 1986, and whereas Fall River resident Keith Manchester was appointed to the original Canal Commission and played a key role in that organization for over 2 decades, and whereas Keith Manchester's valuable contributions and participation in several national and international canal events has helped promote and preserve Nova Scotia's Shuby Canal, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Keith Manchester's outstanding contributions to the Commission and congratulate him upon his recent retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in recent months the economy has proven to be unstable, economic growth has come to a standstill, and governments are on the verge of deficit. And whereas both BMO and Scotiabank have predicted that the worst is yet to come with a recession on the horizon. And whereas it is at a time like this that Nova Scotia needs strong leadership. However, our Premier has no plan. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly urge the Premier to finally show leadership and develop a real plan in the face of economic crisis. Mr. Speaker, I do ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Antigonish resident Bill Kiley was recently inducted to the St. FX Sports Hall of Fame, and whereas Bill Kiley has been part of the St. FX Athletics for 50 years, working in publicity, marketing, game announcing, sports writing, and advocacy, and whereas Bill began as a press box volunteer in 1958, then moved on to the play-by-play position for X-Men games on CJFX radio until '83, and now has been the voice of X-Men football at Olin Stadium since '84. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Bill Kiley on being inducted to the St. FX Sports Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Region of Queens municipality was formed in 1996 and includes the communities of Liverpool, Port Jolly, Brooklyn, Mill Village, Port Medway, Caledonia, Milton, and many more throughout the County of Queens. And whereas in October of this year, the Region of Queens municipality saw 25 people put their names forth in the municipal elections, and whereas the new council, consisting of mayor and 9 councillors, will represent the best interests of the residents of the Region of Queens municipality for the next 4 years. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate Mayor John Leaf and councillors Darlene Norman, Sheldon Brennan, Owen Hamlin, Bruce Inglis, Mervyn Hartland, Randy Dickey, John Croft, Doug Adams, and Peter Waterman on their election to the Region of Queens Municipal Council. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October is Autism Awareness Month, and we in Nova Scotia continue to be challenged by the needs from early childhood to seniors, and whereas there are approximately 7,200 Nova Scotians living with some form of autism, only a small number of which have been able to secure employment, and whereas the most transformational support needs to take place in the early years through the early intensive behavioural intervention, therefore be it resolved, all members of the House call upon the Harper government to implement a national strategy to deal with research, intervention therapy and employment support. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the September 2008 edition of Today's Parents magazine had a feature article entitled The 25 Top Schools in Canada, and whereas Carleton Consolidated School, and Mr. Speaker, the school I attended, was one of the 2 Nova Scotia schools to have the distinction of being named in this very special list. And whereas Principal Linda Gallagher, her teaching and support staff, including cook Heather Thorburn, Secretary Tina Hurlbert, custodian staff, parent, volunteer workers hired to amplify Tri-County School Board's motto, Students First. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud and recognize Carleton Consolidated School staff, students, volunteers for this marvelous achievement. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the community of Sackville and the surrounding areas have seen the work of the long-awaited Access Nova Scotia site break ground this month, whereas the Access Nova Scotia office will positively serve both residents and business, and whereas the Sackville Drive Business Association, along with residents, were the main advocates for this office, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Sackville Drive Business Association and residents for their perseverance for the opening of an Access Nova Scotia office in Lower Sackville, a government service that is long overdue for the community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Excuse me. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Digby Annapolis.
Speaker, it's good to see us all back in the House again. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the arts have always been a fundamental part of Nova Scotia's culture and heritage, and whereas a former professional fiddler, the Premier knows that the funding is important and there's more to the arts than just rich galas subsidized by taxpayers, as his mentor, the Prime Minister, would suggest. Whereas while this government does not have vision to reinstate the Arts Council, one would hope that they have the good sense to oppose the Prime Minister's harsh cuts to arts programs. Therefore, be it resolved that the
Order,
Premier
please.
tell...
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier tell Nova Scotians whether or not he subscribes to the Prime Minister's backward policy on the arts and what his plans are for the future of the arts here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. I hear several noes. The notice is the motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bedford celebrated its 31st annual Bedford Days, which promotes family, fun, culture, and community connectedness, and whereas in 2008, Bedford Days Committee were instrumental in achieving another successful Bedford Days event, and whereas the 2008 Bedford Days Committee give freely of themselves to provide the community with a week of fun-filled activities and events. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the invaluable efforts made by the 2008 Bedford Days Committee. Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bear Point resident Carolyn Kroll has written a book which explores the history of businesses in the county, and whereas the book features research done by Carolyn along with 156 calendars of county businesses dating back to the early 1900s. And whereas Carolyn has donated copies of the book to the Chapel Hill Museum, the Cape Savalon Historical Society, and Shelburne County Museum, and both Clarks Harbour and Barrington Visitor Information Centres. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate Carolyn Kroll for putting in the time and effort to keep the histories of local businesses alive. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each Friday we are reminded of the failure that is gas regulation, and whereas despite numerous groups speaking out against gas regulation, the Conservatives and NDP still believe that regulation is working and serving its purpose. And whereas unless that purpose is to gouge people at the pumps during these tough economic times, the Conservatives and NDP have no foundation on which they can justify their claim. Therefore, be it resolved that the Conservatives and NDP realize that gas regulation has been a failure since day one and move to scrap this failed program immediately. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the world-famous Bay of Fundy is now set to be officially recognized for what many Nova Scotians have known for a long time, and whereas thanks to the Bay of Fundy tourism, the site is now in the running to become one of the new 7 wonders of nature for its many features, including marine diversity comparable to the Amazon rainforest and biological links to the Arctic, Caribbean, South America, and Europe. Whereas the online contest that will determine the Canadian entry on December 31st this year will promote this special place and its incredible potential for tidal power and geology that significantly contributes to global fossil and dinosaur history. While the importance of protecting our natural world makes this contest an exciting, important one, and the organizers at New 7 Wonders of Nature place the Bay along some of the already famous places like Mount Everest and Grand Canyon. Therefore, be resolved all members of this House do their part to encourage as many Nova Scotians as possible to vote online at www.bayoffundytourism.com and ensure the Bay of Fundy's rightful place as one of the new 7 wonders of nature. Mr. Speaker, I request notice and I request everybody to vote. Thank you.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Beth McGee was presented the Citizen of the Year Award at the annual Charter Night of the St. Margaret's Bay Lions Club on September 20th, 2008, whereas Beth is the conscience of our community, taking the lead on the protection of public land in our area, and whereas Beth McGee's initiative is exemplary. Therefore, let it be resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulates Beth McGee on her selection as the St. Margaret's Bay Citizen of the Year. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a sod-turning ceremony recently took place in Glace Bay to mark the start of construction of a new junior high school in Glace Bay. And whereas the Premier, the Education Minister, and many others, including myself, attended that ceremony, and whereas the day has finally come that the people of Glace Bay and students will finally get what they deserve. Mr. Speaker, therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House congratulate the Premier and his government for honouring their commitment and the Minister of Education for being a woman of her word and starting to build the new junior high school in Glace Bay. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sport Nova Scotia's annual Icon Awards was held in June, and whereas Krista Stockman of Wildville, Lunenburg County received the Female Individual Athlete of the Year for Special Olympics Nova Scotia for swimming, and whereas Krista brought home 2 silver medals from the 2007 World Olympic Summer Games in China. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House extend congratulations to Krista Stockman on the receipt of this prestigious award and wish her continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pictou Landing Fire Department began operations shortly after World War II and operated unincorporated until 1976, and whereas the Pictou Landing Fire Department is one of the oldest rural fire departments in northeastern Nova Scotia, and whereas volunteers and auxiliary members give up their time to attend training, respond to fire emergencies in their own district, provide assistance to neighboring districts, maintain equipment, and continuously fundraise to purchase equipment. Therefore,
chatter is a little high. The Honourable Member for
be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly commend Chief Jim Roper and the volunteers of the Pictou Landing Fire Department for their dedication and congratulate them on their ongoing service to Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier blamed opposition parties on CBC Radio this morning for his government's lack of progress on the Fair Access to Regulated Professions Act. And whereas the Minister of Labour and Workplace Development corrected the Premier in the same interview by stating that the reason why the bill has never even been called for debate by the government was the government's failure to consult with stakeholders and not the fault of opposition parties. And whereas once again Nova Scotians are witnesses to this government's left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing method of governing, therefore it be resolved this Premier wake up, point fingers at himself and his government for lack of progress in this House, and stop blaming opposition parties for his inability to govern. And ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Kiwanis Club of the Cayley Golden Cay is being recognized for their 20 years of service to the Northside communities in 2008, and whereas this service organization has delivered more than 105,000 Meals on Wheels, and whereas they've made countless financial donations and provided a wide array of support for local organizations, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating the Kiwanis Club of the Cayley Golden Cay for their outstanding civic and community involvement and wish them nothing but continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate. Thank you.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotians of all ages and all abilities deserve to have equal opportunities to engage in fun, healthy, and active lifestyles, and whereas Helen Anderson of Dartmouth has given selflessly of her time and energy for the past 12 years to provide a monthly social for more than 160 persons with disabilities, and whereas Fred Bashore of Eastern Passage and many other parents and caregivers work hard to support Helen's efforts on behalf of their loved ones and friends, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly commend the efforts of Helen Anderson, Fred Bashore, and all of the other volunteers who work tirelessly to ensure there is a place to hold social activities for persons with mental and physical disabilities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas early childhood educators do far more than just meet the basic needs of young children. They teach and nurture children in their early years with an impact that will last for the rest of their lives. And whereas Joanne Sweet of the King's Tech Campus Learning Centre in Kentville was honoured this summer with a 2008 Prime Minister's Award for teaching excellence in early childhood education for children up to 18 months, and whereas Joanne was one of the first individuals to undergo certification as an early childhood educator and remains on the Certification Council of Nova Scotia as a mentor and facilitator, therefore be resolved that all members of this House applaud the significant accomplishments of Mrs. Joanne Sweet in earning a 2008 Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence in Early Childhood Education. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Saturday, November the 1st, 2008, CBC Radio will mark its 60th year on the airwaves in Cape Breton. And whereas a musical party will be held on this date at the Savoy Theatre to commemorate this memorial occasion. And whereas music and CBC Radio have established a legacy that will live on in the hearts forever and ever. Therefore, be it resolved, the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate CBC Radio for their long-standing commitment to the island of Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Some Beach Somewhere became the fastest 3-year-old in harness racing history when he captured the $134,500 Bluegrass Stakes, the Red Mile Track in Lexington, Kentucky on September 27, 2008. And whereas Some Beach Somewhere, owned by Schooner Stables of Bible Hill, paced the mile in 1:46 and 4, and it was not only the fastest ever by a 3-year-old, but it also equaled the world record for the fastest standardbred mile ever. Whereas Some Beach Somewhere, who has won 18 of 19 career starts and earned more than $2.9 million, will retire and stand at Hanover Shoe Farms at the end of this racing season. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate trainer part owner Brent McGrath, other Schooner Stable partners Gary Pye, Jamie Bagnall, Pam Dean, Stu Rath, Reg Pettipaw, and driver Paul McDonnell on Some Beach Somewhere's outstanding career, and wish Some Beach Somewhere and Schooner Stables continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Easy for you to say. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas lobster fishermen have carried out a peaceful protest near the Cape Sable Island Causeway over the past summer for their concern to the potential damage to both lobster stocks and the habitat from scallop draggers, and whereas fishermen have volunteered to accompany scientists during a test fishery and plan on filming with a remote-operated underwater camera to observe and record lobsters in their molting process. And whereas the Nova Scotia Fisheries have funded Fishermen's Science Research Society projects in the past in Shelburne County, however, fishermen have received no financial support from the provincial or federal fisheries department in light of what would be a valuable information while lobsters are in their molting process. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly request the Nova Scotia Fisheries Agriculture Department to provide funding for this research project for the use of an underwater camera. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I heard a no. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 5th Annual Lunenburg County Business Excellence Awards were held on October 27th to recognize local businesses for their achievements and contribution to the local economy. And whereas 7 Lunenburg County businesses have been chosen to receive these prestigious awards in various categories. And whereas Charles Lance Cabinetry of Garden Lots was awarded the Lunenburg County Business Excellence Grassroots Award. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Charles Lance Cabinetry on being awarded the Lunenburg County Business Excellence Grassroots Award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Prospect Bay Road from Whites Lake to the village of Prospect is in need of a major upgrade and paving, whereas area residents have been extremely patient with patching jobs for far too long, whereas the Prospect Bay Road is a promoted tourist route with numerous noteworthy attractions. Therefore, be it resolved that the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal make the upgrading and paving of the Prospect Bay Road a priority project. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I heard a no. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to a notice given to you in accordance with Rule 43, I'd like to move that to have the business of the House set aside at the hour of interruption for the purpose of dealing with the issue of urgent public importance. Over the past few months, there has been a significant downturn in market activity throughout the entire world. Specifically, the Toronto Stock Exchange, once listed at 12,000 just over a month ago, has dropped by 20% down to 9,500 by the close of business day yesterday. The economic downturn in the United States and in Canada, specifically the subprime mortgage collapse as well as the massive credit crunch, has led to uncertain times in the economic future of our countries. As reported by Stats Canada, Nova Scotia has experienced the lowest real GDP growth out of all provinces across our entire country since 2003. Nova Scotia experienced this slow growth while our country was in relatively good economic times. With a certain global downturn on our front step, it is frightening to think what will happen if we stay the course with our current fiscal and economic policies. The current credit crunch has already crippled many businesses and organizations in our provinces. Just 2 days ago, we heard news of a major company in Nova Scotia forced to fold its restructuring plans because of lack of available financing due to the banking crisis in the United States. It is imperative that we immediately set aside time to discuss and debate the best way of our province to shield itself from the global economic downturn, and furthermore, discuss how we are going to position our province to grow on a sustainable path toward the future. The next generation's economic future in this province greatly depends on how our province reacts in the days and months and years ahead. This matter requires immediate attention of the House, and I would ask that all members of the House support our motion for an emergency debate on the economy.
I have received more than the 2 hours notice of the matter required under Rule 43.2. Under Rule 43.4, I am required to decide whether the matter is proper to be discussed. I have considered the factors set out in the Rule 43.4a, and this is a matter of grave concern to Nova Scotians and which concerns the administrative responsibility of the government and could come within the scope of ministerial action. It is not on the order paper for discussion, and I have no indication that it is likely to be debated within a reasonable time by other means, so I will read the motion and ask whether the Leader of the Liberal Party has the leave of the House for the debate to take place. The motion is that the business of the House be set aside for the purpose of dealing with an issue of urgent public importance, and the subject of the issue has been described by the Leader of the Liberal Party as the best way for our province to shield itself from the global economic downturn and to position the province to grow on a sustainable path towards the future. Does the House agree to give leave for the motion to be debated? Leave having been given, this debate will take place today at the moment of interruption as provided under Rule 43.11. It replaces the late debate. It is a 2-hour period of time that is allowed, with each speaker allowed for 15 minutes at a time. So it will take place at 6 o'clock instead of the hour of interruption. The Honourable, yes, exactly.
Whatever time the hour.
Whatever time the hour of interruption takes place, the emergency debate then takes place, right? Thank you for that clarification. Orders of the day. The time now is 3:33. We will go for 4:33. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you will be to the Premier. In August, Mr. Speaker, this government's quarterly report said that volatile energy costs had the potential to cause significant uncertainties for the Nova Scotia budget. That same update, Mr. Speaker, said that the surplus of the government was now $165 million higher than had been predicted at about $355 million. Well, Mr. Speaker, since that time, the world has entered a period of great economic uncertainty. The credit crunch, the rapidly changing dollar, a crash in commodity prices are now affecting the provincial budget. So my question to the Premier is simply this: when will the House and Nova Scotians receive an economic and financial update showing the effect of the current crisis and the government's response?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, through you to my colleague, Mr. Speaker, As is always the practice, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Finance and the Minister of Finance will gather the appropriate information. Of course, in any financial update, it is required that we receive information from the federal government with respect to personal income taxes, corporate income taxes. There's a number of different elements to that financial update. As is the case, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance will provide that update by the end of December.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier knows that the House won't be sitting at the end of December. At least I don't think it will. I guess we'll see. Mr. Speaker, the heads of major Nova Scotia businesses tell us that they are up all night dealing with the financial markets and analyzing the market for their own products and services. They expect prudent and mature judgment from those in power. In a responsible democracy, the people and the legislature deserve to know how the government is dealing with a challenging situation, and frankly, Mr. Speaker, they expect accountability. So my question for the Premier is, will he tell people what steps his government has taken to assess the impact of the current crisis on its revenue, and how is that going to affect plans for spending?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government began taking the steps with respect to the economy and with respect to our financial situation many years ago, Mr. Speaker. This is not something the government just decided in the last few months to take a look at. This government is responsible, Mr. Speaker, in the last number of years to make sure that we have balanced budgets in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're able to see the growth in our province, Mr. Speaker, and the steps that we have taken and continue to take, Mr. Speaker. In fact, just last week, I met with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Mr. Speaker. This past week, I met with the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, and I will soon meet with the Nova Scotia Chamber of Commerce. And, Mr. Speaker, unlike the Leader of the Opposition, they are much more optimistic about the future of business in this province, and I share their view.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not a matter of optimism. It's a matter of dealing what we have directly in front of us. 6 months ago, the government approved $300 million in extra spending without any public consultation, without legislative approval. The same Conservative government then broke the Premier's word by taxing home electricity. Mr. Speaker, $28 million out of the pockets of ordinary Nova Scotians. Ordinary Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, trying to pack lunch boxes for their children, trying to pay their mortgages. These were bad choices. Although it's now clear that there may be another unbudgeted surplus, so my question to the Premier is this: how will the government deal with any extraordinary revenue in this budget year?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to balanced budgets, Mr. Speaker. Because of the steps of our government and our Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, independent agencies have given us a very high rating, not only in what we're doing at the present time, but on the future outlook, Mr. Speaker, for this province, which, Mr. Speaker, separates us from other provinces across the country, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in the last year in this province, Mr. Speaker, over 10,000 new jobs have been created as a result of the work of this province, Mr. Speaker. And if I listen to the Leader of the Opposition, this province would be in deficit a long time ago.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. We're in the midst of a global economic crisis, but the Premier would have us believe there's nothing we can do about it. While Nova Scotians are becoming concerned about their personal finances, the Premier is wasting time. It is time to act now. So my question to the Premier is, will he immediately disclose an updated financial forecast and be upfront with Nova Scotians about the current state of our province's finances?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government will provide, as I already indicated in the previous answer, its fiscal update, as we should, by the end of December. And as one can appreciate, there's a great deal of information with respect to a financial update of that nature. And Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. I Mr. Speaker, share the view of my colleagues that this is a challenging time globally. It's a challenging time, Mr. Speaker, for our country, and certainly a challenging time for our province. But I have confidence in the ability, Mr. Speaker, of business. I have confidence in our government, Mr. Speaker, and I have confidence that we will be able to get through these challenging times.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party, on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we are in tough economic times, and this requires something more than business as usual. The people of this province are looking for leadership. They are looking for a strategic plan from this government, how they're going to move ourselves forward and weather this storm. So my question for the Premier is, where is your government's plan to weather the economic storm and help move this province forward?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government has already started taking steps, Mr. Speaker, both internally and externally. In fact, the Minister of Finance will meet with his colleagues on Monday. Mr. Speaker, just 2 weeks ago, I met with my colleagues from across the country, the Council of Federation, and we will have a First Ministers meeting coming up in the next couple of weeks. It is very much on the mind of the members of this government to ensure, Mr. Speaker, not only do we stay within our financial framework, but also that we are driving the economy of this province so that we have the dollars necessary to pay for our social programs, Mr. Speaker. Now, if I listened to the opposition in recent weeks, I would hear raise corporate taxes by the NDP, Mr. Speaker. That's what I'd hear. Or if I listened to the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, I'd hear carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Neither of those options would suit Nova Scotia very well.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows he's just misled this House by suggesting that I have supported a carbon tax, and he knows he has misled the House and this House today. And I expect him to retract that by the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. The Premier suggests that the global economic downturn won't affect our province for 6 to 8 months. The fact is, business confidence has recently reached new lows. Global economic downturn won't affect our province for 6 to 8 months. In fact, the business confidence had recently reached a new low. Since 2003, our province has experienced the lowest real growth of any province, 10 out of 10, Mr. Speaker. Last year, we experienced more bankruptcies per capita than any other province. So my question to the Premier is, where is your plan to help weather this economic storm?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in the past, Mr. Speaker, 457,000 people are employed in Nova Scotia, among the highest in record, Mr. Speaker. Since September 2007, approximately 10,500 more people are working in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Year over year, unemployment rates decreased, Mr. Speaker. Labour force increased, Mr. Speaker. This government started planning a long time ago.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the members of the House on this side voted for tax decreases. The members on that side voted for tax increases, Mr. Speaker. But this, Mr. Speaker, is another matter. This is another matter. Several months ago, the government signed a memorandum of understanding with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. It sets out the basis of an effective relationship between the province and municipalities. The guiding principles that the Premier's government endorsed include regular and ongoing consultation, respect for areas of jurisdiction, and a commitment to resolve differences through direct dialogue. So my question for the Premier is this: why did the Premier's government agree to respect municipal jurisdiction if the Premier feels that he has a personal veto over municipal decisions?
Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition may not think development is a good thing, but I can tell you this government does, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand by what I said. The decision that the Council made, I believe, was the wrong decision. I say that, Mr. Speaker, because it sends the wrong message to developers. It sends the wrong message to investment in our capital city. It sends the wrong message in a time, as we were just talking about, Mr. Speaker, that there is some uncertainty in the world, Mr. Speaker. We must do everything we can to see development move forward, Mr. Speaker. I'm beginning to think NDP stands for No Development Please, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Sorry,
first supplementary. You're on your first supplementary.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you over the tax raisers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in August, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations wrote to a resident of Halifax to say that HRM has primary authority over land use matters and that the province's role is very limited. Close quote, Mr. Speaker. I'll table the letter. The minister went on to say, and I quote, "The approval decision correctly remains with the municipal council. Now, I'm sure the minister does not want to see his government use a double standard when it hears complaints about municipal land use decisions. So my supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, will be to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia. What advice does the minister now provide to anyone in HRM who has a complaint about a land use decision from the municipality?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
One of the things that you have to understand, Mr. Speaker, is just because one has the legislative authority to make a decision does not mean that their decisions are correct.
The Honourable. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We on the House, this side of the House, are well aware of that fact. Mr. Speaker, the Halifax Regional Municipality asked this House to enact the Halifax Charter and further legislation to enable the Council to deal with the downtown plan called HRM by Design. The government, Mr. Speaker, left those bills on the order paper, didn't even bother to call them. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this: will he ensure that those HRM bills are called for debate here and now this week with no further delay, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition wasn't supportive of what we brought forward in the spring, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the Opposition, the NDP, would rather see... Mr. Speaker,
Order,
the NDP,
please. The Honourable, the Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the Opposition in this province would rather see parking lots rather than development in the downtown, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that should be parked are their ideas, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spent part of my career working on development, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure that the Premier has. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this. Earlier this month, bulk vendors of heating oil were advised through Tax Bulletin number 5072 that a change to eligibility status of some properties would come into effect on October 14, 2008. The changes will remove the point-of-sale rebate eligibility from any residence that does not have 100% residential status. Oil delivery companies say that they were handed this mess to sort out and that it is creating problems for them and 40,000 of their customers. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, why is he creating this kind of problem for 40,000 Nova Scotians?
The Honourable, the Premier. The Honourable, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the honourable member, Leader of the Opposition, is not indicating that he thinks people who are not entitled to the rebate should get it. So I will just say that because I don't think that's really what he's implying. But what happened was when we put this program into place, and it's a very good program, and even the members of the opposition recommended it, it was not intended for people who had mixed-use properties at point of sale. They were expected to apply for the rebate. And for example, if you were running a business out of your home, for example, a good place around, then obviously you'd be eligible for the rebate on the residential portion, but not on the commercial portion.
Will you get the HST back anyway?
Where you get the HST back anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, what happened is when we put this program together, which benefits so many Nova Scotians, there were two computer systems put together. Unfortunately, as the honourable member points out, there was a glitch. And it was pointed out by one of the people who provide fuel, saying that we just put fuel oil into a fuel tank that clearly is not connected to any residence. Is that appropriate? When we found that out, we sent the auditors in. The auditors looked at it and said, yes, there are some glitches in the system. So there was remedial action taken. In reference to that, the department has put together a list of properties that are not eligible. They have been provided to the distributors now. It's not the massive list that it was. And, Mr. Speaker, we think that the distributors, and I do apologize on behalf of my department for this extra burden that is going on them, but it's not a major thing to overcome, and I think probably within a week or two it will be.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly appreciate the apology from the Minister. But I want to tell him this. He doesn't really understand how many people are affected. Yesterday, I received a letter from Murray Salzman, and I will table it. Murray lives in Grafton, Nova Scotia, on a 10-acre property that hasn't been used by him to make a living. Because the land is partially classified as resource property, he is forced to pay the HST when the fuel is delivered and now apply for the removal of the tax on home heating that, of course, Mr. Speaker, every family deserves. Mr. Salzman says there are many seniors living in small homes on large lots who cannot afford the extra 8% on their fuel bill and submit a request for a refund and wait, as he says, for God knows how long to get it, if ever. So my question for the Premier is this: why is this Premier imposing this kind of red tape on so many Nova Scotia families and seniors?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to suggest to the honourable member that, as I acknowledged in my previous answer, there was a glitch in the implementation of the program, and it has to be straightened out so that the program indeed satisfies the requirements of the Auditor General, among other people. However, Mr. Speaker, the rules have not changed. That property that you just described, as I would understand it, if there had been no glitch in the program, would have had to apply anyway. So for that person, there was no difference.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Salzman also takes issue with what he calls the sneaky manner in which the changes were made. He states, and I'll quote, "This was done in a sneaky way, and the only way I found out about it was when the oil man delivered my oil." Mr. Speaker, this is no way to run a government. Most of those people should have had the tax removed from their home energy costs as the Premier promised. So my question is this to the Premier: how can such an important change for as many as 40,000 Nova Scotian households be made without any advance notice to the families and seniors who are being charged more for each fuel delivery?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I just draw to the attention of the House this energy rebate program, which we have in place, is something that the Leader of the Opposition and his colleagues voted against. So, Mr. Speaker, standing up and voting against a program and then questioning why it's not better is a little oxymoronical, I think, Mr. Speaker, but
order, please. Order. Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations has the floor.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Again, for the individuals which the honourable member has cited, I do apologize on behalf of our department. But the fact is that were the rules of the game, Mr. Speaker, when the program was implemented. We got into a situation where we found that there were some glitches. Only good government would make sure that those deficiencies were remedied, and that's what happened. Hear, hear.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. The Premier has been musing about intervening in recent decisions by HRM Council to deny a development project along the Halifax waterfront. In light of the fact that many Nova Scotians are already feeling the effects of a weakening economy and this government's history of economic mismanagement, Nova Scotians are demanding to know why the Premier was unwilling to show this leadership and prevent the Utility Review Board from considering a power rate increase that will negatively affect every individual and burden business across this province. So my question to the Speaker is, when will your priorities reflect those of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Liberal Party speaks to the government's commitment with respect to economic development and speaks to the development project in the downtown, Mr. Speaker. And I want to expand on my previous answer about the importance of seeing more investment in our downtown core, Mr. Speaker. We have the opportunity to see more financial service sector jobs coming to Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and they want more Class A space. That's why we need more development in the downtown. But, Mr. Speaker, this impacts much more broadly than simply Halifax. I ran into a tradesperson in the southern part of Nova Scotia, in Yarmouth, last week, Mr. Speaker, who unfortunately finds himself in a situation where he leaves the province to find additional work. I want to make sure that Nova Scotian has the opportunity to work on projects right here, Mr. Speaker, and he can join the other 10,500 people who also found work in Nova Scotia during the past year, Mr. Speaker. I believe that projects like this should move forward for that individual and all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the Premier, this caucus will not choose a specific project that might have a friend of his who wants to develop it. We would encourage the Premier and his government to call before this House HRM by design, which my caucus is more than prepared to support, so that Nova Scotian development can happen for all developers, Mr. Speaker, not a specific developer. Given the recent profit reports by Nova Scotia Power and the recent decline in commodity prices and the dramatic effect the power rate increases will be having in our province, my question to the Premier is, will you intervene and stop any power rate increases in the upcoming year?
The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the honourable member. I can assure all Nova Scotians we have had intervener status and we have not agreed to the increase that's proposed by Nova Scotia Power.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, time and time again, the Premier has shown absolutely no leadership on this issue, what most Nova Scotians are looking for. So my final question is simple. Will you join the Liberal caucus in calling that the Utility Review Board deny this power rate increase?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, in the last few months, what I've heard from the Liberal Party is to introduce a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, which would mean, Mr. Speaker, when you take a look, even when you take a look at what was presented with the income taxes, Mr. Speaker, it would cost Nova Scotians about $160 million to the average, to all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Another $26 million directly to government. $186 million a year leaving Nova Scotia and going to Ottawa, Mr. Speaker. If that's his idea of smart policy, Mr. Speaker, I disagree.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the real tax increaser in this House. The Premier raised taxes by $28 million a year in his last budget. By raising taxes, he placed a serious burden on families just months before one of the worst economic crises to ever face this province, Mr. Speaker. Now families will have to carry the burden of this $28 million tax increase through a very, very difficult winter in terms of weather and finances, Mr. Speaker. So my question through you to the Premier, can he explain to this House how raising taxes by $28 million a year will help families deal with the severe economic and winter crisis they will be facing?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker, and I assume that the honourable member was referring to the changes in the energy rebate program, and that $28 million thing turned into about somewhere around a $92 million program for Nova Scotia.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier and his party clearly live in a world of make-believe. So I want to put some facts on the table, Mr. Speaker. Here's fact one. In 2006, the now Premier promised to cut the HST in home energy. Here's another fact. Last spring, the Premier raised taxes on home energy for hardworking families to the tune of $28 million, Mr. Speaker. So question to the tax raiser, Mr. Speaker, is very simple. Why should Nova Scotians believe you when it comes to tax increases after your erratic leadership on this very issue?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of the package that the government has put forward, a $92 million package, Mr. Speaker, which is going to help Nova Scotians this winter, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it not only looks at the short-term challenges that individuals face, Mr. Speaker, it also looks at the long term. It looks at issues, Mr. Speaker, such as the heating assistance rebate program, an increase up to $450, Mr. Speaker. It makes sure that we deal and partner with groups like the Salvation Army to help more low-income Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. It also includes your energy rebate, about $47 million, Mr. Speaker. And it also looks at energy efficiency ideas under the leadership of the Minister of Energy, Mr. Speaker. These are all initiatives, Mr. Speaker, that member and the NDP voted against. They voted against helping Nova Scotians who need it most. They voted against a rebate program, Mr. Speaker, to help individuals and our seniors in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know who supported the budget. They know who voted against the budget, who are standing up for their rights, Mr. Speaker, and will continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we did vote against tax increases, and we're proud we did it, Mr. Speaker. When